Nature Near Home and Other Papers by John Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nature Near Home and Other Papers by John Burroughs. Section 12. In Field and Wood. Intense Observation. The casual glances or the admiring glances that we cast upon nature do not go very far in making us acquainted with her real ways. Only long and close scrutiny can reveal these to us. The look of appreciation is not enough. The eye must become critical and analytical if we would know the exact truth. Close scrutiny of an object in nature will nearly always yield some significant fact that our admiring gaze did not take in. I learned a new fact about the teasel the other day by scrutinizing it more closely than I had ever before done. I discovered that the wave of bloom begins in the middle of the head and spreads both ways, up and down, whereas in all other plants known to me with flowering heads or spikes, except the goldenrod and the steeplebush, the wave of bloom begins at the bottom and creeps upward like a flame. In the goldenrod it drops down from branch to branch. In vervain, in blueweed, in Venus's looking-glass, in the mullein, in the evening primrose, and others, the bloom creeps slowly upward from the bottom. But with the teasel the flame of bloom is first kindled in the middle. Today you see the head with this purple zone or girdle about it, and in a day or two you see two purple girdles with an open space between them, and these move, one up and the other down, till the head stands with a purple base and a purple crown with a broad space of neutral green between them. This is a sample of the small but significant facts in nature that interest me, exceptional facts that show how nature at times breaks away from a fixed habit, a beaten path, so to speak, and tries a new course. She does this in animal life too. Huxley mentions a curious exception to the general plan of the circulation of the blood. In all animals that have a circulation, the blood takes one definite and invariable direction, except in the case of one class of marine animals, called ascidians. In them the heart, after beating a certain number of times, stops and begins to beat the opposite way, so as to reverse the current. Then in a moment or two it changes again and drives the blood in the other direction. All things are possible with nature, and these unexpected possibilities or departures from the general plan are very interesting. It is interesting to know that any creature can come into being without a father, but with only a grandfather. Yet such is the case. The drone in the hive has no father. The eggs of the unfertilized queen produces drones. That is, in producing males, the male is dispensed with. It is to produce the neuters or the workers that the service of the male is required. The queen bee is developed from one of these neuter eggs. Hence her male offspring have only a grandfather. The chipmunk is an old friend of my boyhood and my later years also, but by scrutinizing his ways a little more closely than usual the past summer, I learned things about this pretty little rodent that I did not before know. I discovered, for instance, that he digs his new hole for his winter quarters in midsummer. In my strolls afield or along the road in July, I frequently saw a fresh pile of earth upon the grass near a stone fence, or in the orchard, or on the edge of the woods, usually a peck or two of bright new earth carefully put down in a pile upon the ground, without any clue visible as to where it probably came from. But a search in the grass or leaves usually disclosed its source, a little round hole, neatly cut through the turf and leading straight downward. I came upon 10 such mounds of earth upon a single farm, and found the hole from which each came only 1 to 6 feet away. In one case, in a meadow recently mowed, I had to explore the stubble with my finger over several square yards of surface before I found the squirrel's hole, so undisturbed was the grass around it. Not a grain of soil had this little delver dropped near it, and not the slightest vestige of a path had he made from the tunnel to the dump. And this feature was noticeable in every case. The hole had been dug several yards underground, and several pecks of fresh earth removed to a distance of some feet, without the least speck of soil, or the least trace of the workman's footsteps showing near the entrance. Such clean, deft workmanship was remarkable. All this half bushel or more of earth the squirrel must have carried out in his cheek pockets, and he must have made hundreds of trips to and fro from his dump to his hole, and yet if he had flown like a bird the turf could not have been freer from the marks of his going and coming. And he had cut down through the turf as one might have done with an auger, without bruising or disturbing in any way the grass about the edges. It was a clean, neat job in every case, so much so that it was hard to believe that the delver did not come up from below and have a back door from whence he carried his soil some yards away. Indeed, I have heard this theory stated. "Look under the pile of earth," said a friend who was with me and who had observed the work of the pocket gopher in the West, "and you will find the back door there." But it was not so. I carefully removed 4 piles of earth and dug away the turf beneath them, and no hole was to be found. One day we found a pile of earth in a meadow, and near it a hole less than 2 inches deep, showing where the chipmunk had begun to dig and had struck a stone. Then he went a foot or more up the hill and began again. Here he soon struck stones as before. Then he went still farther up the hill, and this time was successful in penetrating the soil. This was conclusive proof that these round holes are cut from above and not from below, as we often see in the case of the woodchuck hole. The squirrel apparently gnaws through the turf, instead of digging through, and carries away the loosened material in his mouth, never dropping or scattering a grain of it. No home was ever built with less litter, no cleaner dooryard from first to last can be found. The absence of anything like a trail or beaten way from the mound of earth to the hole, or anything suggesting passing feet, I understood better when, later in the season, day after day I saw Chipmunk carrying supplies into his den, which was in the turf by the roadside about 10 feet from a stone wall. He covered the distance by a series of short jumps, apparently striking each time upon his toes between the spears of grass, and leaving no marks whatever by which his course could be traced. This was also his manner of leaving the hole, and doubtless it was his manner in carrying away the soil from his tunnel to the dumping pile. He left no sign upon the grass. He disturbed not one spear about the entrance. There was a mystery about this den by the roadside of which I have just spoken. The pile of earth could not be found. Unless the roadmaker had removed it, it must have been hidden in or beneath the stone wall. And there was a mystery about some of the other holes that was absolutely baffling to me. In at least 4 mounds of fresh earth I found freshly dug stones that I could not by any manipulation get back into the hole out of which they had evidently come. They were all covered with fresh earth, and were in the pile of soil with many other smaller stones. In one case a stone 2 inches long, 1 1/2 inches broad, and 1/2 inch thick was found. In 2 other cases stones of about the same length and breadth, but not so thick, were found, and in neither case could the stone be forced into the hole. In still another case the entrance to the den was completely framed by the smaller roots of a beech tree, and in the little mound of earth near it were 2 stones that could only be gotten back into the hole by springing one of these roots, which required considerable force to do. In 2 at least of these 4 cases it was a physical impossibility for the stones to have come out of the hole from whence the mound of earth and the lesser stones evidently came. Yet how happened they in the pile of earth, freshly earth-stained? The squirrel could not have carried them in his cheek pouches, they were so large. How, then, did he carry them? The matter stood thus with me for some weeks. I was up against a little problem in natural history that I could not solve. Late in November I visited the scene of the squirrel holes again, and at last got the key to the mystery. The cunning little delver cuts a groove in one side of the hole just large enough to let the stone through, then packs it full of soil again. When I made my November visit it had been snowing and raining and freezing and thawing, and the top of the ground was getting soft. A red squirrel had visited the hole in the orchard, where 2 of the largest stones were found in the pile of earth, and had apparently tried to force his way into the chipmunk's den. In doing so he had loosened the earth in the groove, softened by the rains, and it had dropped out. The groove was large enough for me to lay my finger in, and just adequate to admit the stones into the hole. This, then, was the way the little engineer solved the problem, and I experienced a sense of relief that I had solved mine. I visited the second hole, where the large stone was in the pile of earth, and found that the same thing had happened there. A red squirrel, bent on plunder, had been trying to break in, and had removed the soil in the groove. I feel bound to report that the next season I found a pile of earth which a chipmunk had removed from his den, containing a stone too large to go into the hole, yet the most careful examination failed to reveal that there had ever been any groove cut in it, or that it had ever been in any way enlarged. To settle the point as to whether or not the chipmunk has a back door, which in no case had I been able to find, we dug out the one by the roadside, whose mound of earth we could not discover. We followed his tortuous course through the soil 3 or 4 feet from the entrance, and nearly 3 feet beneath the surface, where we found him in his chamber, warm in his nest of leaves, but not asleep. He had no back door. He came out, it was a male, as a hand was thrust into his chamber, and the same fearless, strong hand seized him, but did not hurt him. His chamber was spacious enough to hold about 4 quarts of winter stores, and leave him considerable room to stir about in. His supplies consisted of the seeds of the wild buckwheat, Polygonum dumetorum, and chokecherry pits, and formed a very unpromising looking mess. His buckwheat did not seem to have been properly cured, for much of it was mouldy, but it had been carefully cleaned, every kernel of it. There were nearly 4 quarts of seeds altogether, and over 1/2 of it was wild buckwheat. I was curious to know approximately the number of these seeds he had gathered and shucked. I first found the number it took to fill a lady's thimble, and then the number of thimbles full it took to fill a cup, and so reached the number in the 2 quarts, and found that it amounted to the surprising figure of 250,000. Think of the amount of patient labor required to clean 250,000 of the small seeds of the wild buckwheat. The grains are hardly 1/3 of the size of those of the cultivated kind, and are jet black when the husk is removed. Probably every seed was husked with those deft little hands and teeth as it was gathered, before it went into his cheek pockets, but what a task it must have been! Poor little hermit, it seemed pathetic to find him facing the coming winter there with such inferior stuff in his granary. Not a nut, not a kernel of corn or wheat. Why he had not availed himself of the oats that grew just over the fence, I should like to know. Of course, the wild buckwheat must have been more to his liking. How many hazardous trips along fences and into the bushes his stores represented! The wild creatures all live in as savage a country as did our earliest ancestors, and the enemy of each is lying in wait for it at nearly every turn. Digging the little fellow out, of course, brought ruin upon his house, and I think the muse of natural history contemplated the scene with many compunctions of conscience, if she has any conscience, which I am inclined to doubt. But our human hearts prompted us to do all we could to give the provident little creature a fresh start. We put his supplies carefully down beside the stone wall into which he had disappeared on being liberated, and the next day he had carried a large part of them away. He evidently began at once to hustle, and I trust he found or made a new retreat from the winter before it was too late. I doubt if the chipmunk ever really hibernates. The hibernating animals do not lay up winter stores, but he no doubt indulges in many very long before dinner and after dinner naps. It is black as night there in his den 3 feet under the ground, and this lasts about 4 months, or until the premonitions of coming spring reach him in March and call him forth. I am curious to know if the female chipmunk also digs a den for herself, or takes up with one occupied by the male the previous winter. One ought to be safe in generalizing upon the habits of chipmunks in digging their holes, after observing 10 of them, yet one must go slow even then. 9 of the holes I observed had a pile of earth near them, the 10th hole had no dump that I could find. Then I found 4 holes with the soil hauled out and piled up about the entrance precisely after the manner of woodchucks. This was a striking exception to the general habit of the chipmunks in this matter. Is this the way the female digs her hole, I asked myself, or is it the work of young chipmunks? I have in 2 cases found holes in the ground on the borders of swamps, occupied by weasels, but the holes were in all outward respects like those made by chipmunks, with no soil near the entrance. The woodchuck makes no attempt to conceal his hole by carrying away the soil, neither does the prairie dog, nor the pocket gopher. The pile of telltale earth in each case may be seen from afar, but our little squirrel seems to have notions of neatness and concealment that he rarely departs from. The more I study his ways, the more I see what a clever and foxy little rodent he is. End of Section 12. Recording by Edith Fern, Southern California, November 20th, 2009.